The Retroid Pocket 3 Plus is an absolutely fantastic emulation handheld device, but it was brought out to be an improvement over the Retroid Pocket 3 and bring us even closer to that awesome PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation. And today we're going to discuss if it achieves that and if it's worth your hard-earned money. Straight off the bat, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus brings with it a whole host of improvements, including a more powerful processor, extra RAM, nicer feeling buttons if you like that conductive rubber feel, which I personally do, more battery power taking us from 4,000 milliamps to 4,500, more onboard storage taking us from 32GB to 128GB, but all for the added cost of $30. Now, in all fairness, those improvements are pretty significant for a $30 price hike, especially when you consider the fact that the Retroid Pocket 3 was about $20 more than the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus and didn't really bring with it that much hardware improvement. The Retroid Pocket 3 Plus is improving in significant areas. Obviously the CPU and the RAM, but also the battery life and the onboard storage are really big bonuses to me, as well as Retroid finally getting around to actually putting the conductive rubber buttons in instead of expecting consumers to have to do that themselves. Now, I know a lot of consumers like me as well out there felt quite cheated by this kind of release schedule, but I just want to help you out a little bit here, guys, because it's not as bad as it could seem. You see, those of us who already bought the Retroid Pocket 3 are kind of in a fortunate position where we have those devices, and those devices are still quite highly sought after on eBay. Now, I know it's more effort than it's worth, but if you were to sell your Retroid Pocket 3 device on eBay, you would easily make the money back that you spent buying it in the first place, meaning that you could undo the mistake, if you see it that way, of buying a Retroid Pocket 3, so then you can then go ahead and buy a Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. Now, I'm not saying you should do that, I'm not saying you have to do that. If you've got a Retroid Pocket 3, it's a fantastic device anyway, and we'll get into whether the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus is really worth the extra money in a minute. But over the past few weeks and months, I've heard from a lot of you and heard all the frustrations that you have. So I just wanted to help you out a little bit in seeing that you aren't entirely trapped if you do want to change your decision. Granted, we shouldn't have to do these things, but it is what it is. Now, when it comes to emulation, everything up to the PlayStation 1, Dreamcast and N64 generation was fantastically handled on the Retroid Pocket 3. So the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus absolutely has no problem with these. The extra power is almost unneeded in those areas. PSP emulation, where the Retroid Pocket 3 felt like it was perfectly ergonomically designed to handle PSP emulation, clearly takes an improvement with the extra power for the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. But I know the area you guys really want to know if it's worthwhile is the PlayStation 2 and GameCube. And we're going to cover that in the most detail in a minute, because there's one thing I just want to discuss before that. An area of functionality that these retro handhelds deal with that isn't covered a lot in these retro handheld reviews is the Android gaming and the online streaming. Devices like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus are every bit as much an Android gaming system and a cloud streaming system as it is a retro emulation device. In some respects, it's probably mostly an Android gaming machine as it runs on Android. And whereas I have my issues with Android gaming currently because it doesn't feel like it's reached that level yet where Android games are designed to work on systems with controllers. Most of those games are designed to work on touchscreens. My best example for that is the Formula 1 racing game. A game that would be perfect on a system like this if you could use the controls, but it forces you to use the touchscreen. Those are issues that happen to be with the games themselves and the culture of Android gaming. But a device like the Retroid Pocket 3 is perfectly designed to handle as many Android games as possible. And with the extra power and the extra RAM that the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus has, if Android gaming eventually takes that next step and becomes a true gaming option, you're going to have a device in the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus that is ready for that jump. And that, in my eyes, is a very welcome improvement. Following on with game streaming services like Game Pass and the new PlayStation options, not to mention moonlighting to your PC, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus is a fantastic device for this area as well, giving you the opportunity for true AAA gaming in the palm of your hand. The ability to play the types of games you could never dream of playing on your Nintendo Switch. Now, granted, when it comes to game streaming, processing power itself isn't that big a factor. It's mostly to do with the Wi-Fi that you have and the Wi-Fi connectivity around you. But with the great Wi-Fi built into the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, you'll have no issue with this. And you'll also have no issue downloading as many of those PlayStation 2 and GameCube ROMs as you want. Yep, it's time to talk about the PS2 and GameCube emulation. Now, when it comes to the world of emulation, and PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation in particular as well, playing around and tinkering with settings can give you a huge amount of improvements within the actual emulators and the devices themselves. There is no doubt that with the correct settings, you could take the jump from 40 frames per second all the way up to perfection of 60 frames per second in certain games. And this is a world that is ever changing and forever discussed in the world of PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation currently, because this is the hottest topic and the hottest area. Devices like the AY and Odin really kicked it off, and devices like the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus jumped in, and now we have the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus as well. So yes, with a lot of tinkering and a lot of settings, you can get huge improvements in your performance for PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation. However, I'm always very keen on discussing the power of the device going in, emulating these systems on stock settings completely, because I find that's the best and fairest way to compare a device like for like. Once you start tinkering with settings and trying to get the best performance from each device, it starts to become a little bit unfair if those settings are different. So with all my direct comparisons, they are always stock. And any small changes I do make, for example, changing the GPU renderer from OpenGL to Vulkan, because let's say game's completely unplayable on the other renderer, I make it absolutely clear and I make the same change on both devices. So with that being said, the Retroid Pocket 3 and the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus compared like for like, you can definitely see a noticeable improvement in PlayStation 2 and GameCube games on the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. Now before we get too excited, they have not reached perfection yet. You are not going to get 100% coverage, especially of PlayStation 2 games. And of the many games that you can play comfortably, most of them won't be 60 frames per second either. Now I know this is incredibly frustrating for a lot of you to hear, because we're waiting and waiting and waiting for the next device and the next device and the next device to hopefully just get us that PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation that we just really want. Clean, 100% coverage. And honestly, right now, the only system I've ever used that has that is the Steam Deck. And that is in a completely different category. But for any of you that were hoping for perfect PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus does not do that yet. But there is still so much to get excited about. There were so many games on the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus and the Retroid Pocket 3 that I wanted to play and I wanted to enjoy in the palm of my hand. Games like Time Splitters, games like NBA Street, games like Extreme G3. All of these games felt so close on the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus and the Retroid Pocket 3, but they just weren't fully playable. The frame rate, although I will accept a drop in frame rate comfortably, the frame rate was too low. I couldn't enjoy those games. Whereas on the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, with stock settings, those games are entirely playable and comfortable to enjoy. Now once again, a lot of these games are not going to be running at 60 frames per second, so if you're a connoisseur that needs that high level of performance, you're going to either have to play with settings a lot or wait for the next device. But if you're somebody like me who can fully enjoy a game at 40 frames per second, then it is a huge improvement. So to put it into context, a lot of these games run at 20 frames per second on the Retroid Pocket 3 are now running at 40 frames per second on the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. And that kind of jump exists for all games across the board. So games that were pretty much not playable at all are slightly more playable. Games that were slightly playable are now a lot more playable. And the games that were really quite playable are playing perfectly. There's not a game that I played where I didn't notice that difference, and you can see that in the direct comparison videos that I did. Now for a lot of you out there, I realize 60 frames per second is where it has to be. You're connoisseurs, you need that level of performance. But for a lot of us out there, 40 frames per second is okay. And to put it into context, if you think about the PlayStation 5 and when the Miles Morales game came out for it, there were two performance settings that you could play Miles Morales on. You could have the highest level of performance, which ran the game at 60 frames per second, but it didn't have the global illumination to make the world look quite as pretty. Or you could run the game with global illumination and make all the lighting look fantastic, but it ran at 40 frames per second. They were choices and options that you could play in a current AAA game. And in both of those settings, although if you wanted to look at the differences, you could notice them, you could fully play through Miles Morales 100% comfortably on 40 frames per second and truly enjoy it. So playing a retro game at 40 frames per second, unless you're looking at a fighting game or something which really requires those frames, for the most part it's going to remain entirely enjoyable. Now I realize I'm covering PlayStation 2 and GameCube in the same breath here, because although as systems themselves and how difficult they are to emulate is quite different, the differences and the improvements that the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus has over the Retroid Pocket 3 is similar for the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube. So we can talk about them in the same kind of way. If you want completely direct comparisons of the two systems for PlayStation 2 and GameCube, then you can check out the comparison videos that I did. But we still have a little bit more to discuss, and that's because the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus now has taken that next step. It's not just taken the next step over the Retroid Pocket 3, but it's brought it a little bit closer to an AY and Odin. Brought it closer to the power, but the price is still so much lower, which now brings the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus genuinely into the discussion of whether you should buy one of these instead of an AYN Odin. And that for me is a really interesting debate and topic. Now granted, there are other things to consider about the AYN Odin as well, including the size, but if we're looking at PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation, it becomes a lot more interesting. And if you want to find out more as to whether it's worth putting all that extra money into an AOI and Odin or getting yourself a much cheaper Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, then you need to check out these direct comparison videos right here.